The GRANDstack Starter Project is the easiest way to get started with GraphQL, React, Apollo, and Neo4j Database. In this video, we'll take a hands-on look at the GRANDstack Starter Project, connecting it to a Neo4j instance running in Neo4j Sandbox, and deploying our React application and GraphQL API to Netlify. This diagram shows the basic image for a GRANDstack application. The front end is a React application using Apollo client, which queries a GraphQL API on top of a Neo4j database. The core piece of our GraphQL API is a library called Neo4j GraphQL.js, which can take GraphQL type definitions and generate Neo4j database queries simply from GraphQL type definitions, not requiring implementations of resolvers. So let's get started. We'll run npx create-grandstack-app, and then I chose to name my application GRANDstack-app, but this could be anything we want. This will download the latest version of the create-grandstack-app command line tool, which will then fetch the latest release of the GRANDstack Starter Project and then prompt us to configure the application. So first we create a new directory for the application, download the latest GRANDstack release. The release also comes with an Angular UI implementation, which we remove unless we explicitly specify that. By default, we want to use the React implementation. We then check to make sure we have recent release of Node and npm available. We then install the GRANDstack CLI tool. This is a more advanced command line tool that we won't cover in this video, but it's useful for things like inferring GraphQL type definitions from an existing database or some deployment options. You can find more information in the docs about that. Then we install the dependencies for our two main projects in the starter project, the API, which is our GraphQL API using Neo4j GraphQL.js and Apollo server, and then the React front-end application. Once those dependencies are done installing, we're prompted to now configure our application to connect to Neo4j. Let's create a Neo4j Sandbox instance that we can connect our application to. So we'll go to neo4j.com/sandbox. Neo4j Sandbox allows us to provision hosted Neo4j instances that are still private to me, but they're available for free. So a great way to develop our application. There's a number of data sets available. I'm going to go ahead and select the blank sandbox since I want just an empty Neo4j database. So now a Neo4j database is being provisioned, hosted in the cloud somewhere. Once this is done provisioned, then I'll be able to see the connection credentials that again will be private to me for this Neo4j instance, as well as access Neo4j browser, which will allow me to run Cypher queries against the database. Okay, so this is now provisioned and ready to go. I can see my connection credentials for the database. Let's go ahead and open up Neo4j browser and just make sure that our database is empty. So let's run match in, return count in. We should get back 0. Yep, so nothing in the database. Let's copy the bolt URL. So this is the connection string that we'll use for our GraphQL API to connect to Neo4j to execute database queries. Do we want an encrypted connection? For Neo4j Sandbox, we select no, since we don't have that configured for an encrypted connection to Neo4j. The Neo4j user, if we go back to our connection details, is Neo4j. Here's the password, so I'll copy that and paste in the password. Great, so this configuration will be saved to this .env file, which I can then modify later on if I want to change any of those settings. There's some additional settings in there as well that I can configure. So now I'm ready to start my application. So we'll cd into the GRANDstack app directory and npm run start. This command will start both the GraphQL server and the React web server as well. While this is running, it says we can also seed our database. So I'm going to open a new terminal, cd into GRANDstack app/API, and run npm run seeddb. This will execute some GraphQL mutations against our running GraphQL API that will load some sample data into Neo4j. So it says database seeded. Now if we go back to our Neo4j browser and run this match in return count in query again, now we have 36 nodes in the database. Let's see what kind of data we have. We'll run db schema visualization, and we can see we have some user nodes that are connected to reviews, that are connected to businesses that are in a category. So we have some business and user review information now in the database. And it looks like our GRANDstack app now is done building and is being served here over this local web server. So this is what it looks like. Here is the sort of overview dashboard application view of the businesses and ratings brought to us through our GraphQL API into our React app. So we have a total of 4 users that were found. We can see a histogram distribution of the ratings, and then we see a table with a list of some of the most recent ratings. We can also search for users in the database. We can filter for different parts of their name. So here's all the users with an I. We can order by their average stars and so on. So a fairly simple application, just meant to give us a starting point for building our GRANDstack application. Okay, let's open this up in a text editor. I like to use VS Code, but it doesn't really matter. And we'll take a look at some of the code here. So there are 2 main packages in the GRANDstack Starter Project. The API project, which is our GraphQL API, and the web React directory, which has our React application. If we look in the API directory in source index.js, we can see this is a Node.js GraphQL server. First thing we're doing is pulling in some type definitions, GraphQL type definitions from our GraphQL schema file. So this is what is driving our GraphQL API and the queries to the database. We're defining the types here, as well as what fields are available on each type. So users, businesses, reviews. You can see here we also have some fields that are defined with the Cypher schema directive. This allows us to define computed fields in our GraphQL API using Cypher. And we have a few query and mutation fields that use these Cypher directives as well. If we jump back to index.js, we can see we're also pulling in Apollo server, the Neo4j driver, and this make augmented schema function from Neo4j GraphQL.js. This make augmented schema function, this is an important piece of our GraphQL server. This is what we pass our type definitions to, and it then generates an executable GraphQL schema object. So this includes all the logic for fetching data from the database, but also generates things like mutations, filtering, pagination fields in our schema as well. Then we create a driver connected to our Neo4j instance, in this case reading the credentials to connect to Neo4j from that .env file. We also run some database initialization steps. In this case, we configure some constraints and indexes before starting the GraphQL server. Then we start the GraphQL server using Apollo server, passing the driver connection into the context object, and spin up our GraphQL server. So our GraphQL server is running on localhost 4001/GraphQL. Here's GraphQL Playground. If we take a look at the Docs tab, we can see the query mutation fields, and we can see everything that's been added from just our type definition. So we get an entry point into the API for each of the types that we've defined. We also have generated mutations that allow us to create, read, update, and delete data. Here's an example query. Let's go ahead and run this. So here we're looking for the first 10 reviews ordered by date in descending order. Then we're getting the user, the business, the date, and some information about the review. And this is the exact GraphQL query that this recent reviews component is running to populate the data here. Okay, let's go ahead and now deploy this application to Netlify. So Netlify allows us to deploy static content, but we can also deploy functions, serverless functions. So in this case, we'll deploy our React application as static content, and our GraphQL API will be deployed via Netlify as a serverless function. So before we do that, we need to create a GitHub repository for this project we just created. Netlify allows us to connect to GitHub and then trigger a deploy for each push to that GitHub repository. So let's create a new repository. Let's just call it GRANDstack-app. And I'm just going to copy this line here, jump back to the terminal, and in the GRANDstack app directory, let's create a Git repo. Let's add everything and do an initial commit. Then connect to that repo on GitHub, and let's push everything up. Okay, so that's been pushed up to GitHub. If we refresh, we should see everything that we just pushed up, as well as the README for the GRANDstack Starter Project, which has lots of information on how to configure this, how to deploy to different services, and so on. Now, if we switch back over to Netlify, we will connect this GitHub repository to a Netlify project. So let's do a new site from Git, connect to GitHub, and we want to search for the GRANDstack app project. So we'll select that. And we've already defined the build commands in the GRANDstack Starter Project specific to Netlify, so we don't need to worry about that. We do, however, need to add 3 environment variables. And these are the environment variables that we specified with the create-grandstack-app command line tool. However, we don't want to check in that .env file. We don't want to check that in and push that up to GitHub. So instead, we'll specify any environment variables that have database connection credentials, for example. We'll specify that here in the Netlify UI. So we need a Neo4j URI, Neo4j user, and Neo4j password, which again we have for our sandbox. So I'll copy the bolt URL. That is our Neo4j URI. Neo4j is the Neo4j user, and we'll copy the password here. And click Deploy Site. Now this will pull down the project from GitHub and trigger a build on Netlify, both for the React project, which will then be served over a CDN, and the GraphQL API will be deployed as a serverless function on AWS Lambda. So while this is running, let's jump back into the code here. We can first take a look at the serverless function that gets deployed for our GraphQL API to run as a Lambda. And this looks very similar to the code we were looking at for running our GraphQL server locally, with a couple of differences. One is we're pulling in Apollo server Lambda instead of the base Apollo server project, but we're still using make augmented schema to create a executable GraphQL schema from the same type definitions that we had defined before, and now we're exporting a serverless handler for our function. Let's also take a look at the web React directory. So this is the code for our React application. And this uses the Apollo client React hooks to execute GraphQL queries against our GraphQL API to load data. The most interesting components to look at, let's start with the user count component. So if we jump back and take a look at our application, this is the user count component where it's just displaying the number of users found in the GraphQL API. So here we're pulling in the useQuery hook from Apollo React hooks. We have a very simple GraphQL query that we're running, just the user count field on the query type. We have a functional React component. We run the query, and if we have an error, we return an error. If we're in loading state, we just return loading. Otherwise, we return back the user count that we get back from the GraphQL API. A query that is a little bit more complicated is our ratings chart. So here we have a slightly more complex GraphQL query. We pass that data then into a chart component to render that. And our final component here that uses GraphQL is the user list. Let's take a look at that component here. If we click on View Users, that was the component that allows us to search for users by name or do some ordering. So this component is a little bit more complicated because it has some state to deal with. And here we can see how to use GraphQL variables in our query. Okay, let's jump over to Netlify and see if our deploy is finished. Looks like that is and has been published. So our site is live. So we get a nice URL specific for this project. So we've deployed both our React application and the GraphQL API that this application is talking to, connected to our Neo4j instance running on Neo4j Sandbox. So that's a basic overview of the GRANDstack Starter Project. From here, we can go in and start to add our own logic, change the schema depending on the data that we want to work with, and so on. But this is a good starting point now for building our application. If you want to learn more about GRANDstack, the best resource is grandstack.io, which has the documentation for working with Neo4j GraphQL JS and all things GRANDstack. If we look in the Resources tab, there's lots of info here as well, from videos and blog posts on how to get started. So that's it for now, and I will see you all later. Cheers.